Hello everyone, my name is Nicolas Ojeda and today I'll be your substitute literature teacher. For today's class, we will be taking a look at the Victorian period. Then we will move on to two very important movements that took place within the period. And finally, we will pay special focus to one novel written in the Victorian age and its relevance to its time. So, the Victorian period, what is this? Well, the term Victorian period is often used to cover the whole of the 19th century. The Victorian period is an age of British history spanning the 64th reign of Queen Victoria. The period is marked by many important social and historical changes that altered the nation in many ways. The population got nearly doubled and the British Empire expanded. The period saw the British Empire grow to become the first global industrial power. The country became the workshop of the world, and from the 1870s onward it had become the world's banker. The invention of steam power was exploited for railways and ships, for printing presses, for industrial looms, and for agricultural machinery. An efficient postal service was developed, the telephone invented, and communications were greatly improved. However, the Victorian period was marked by complexity. Even though it was a time of unprecedented changes, because it really was, it was also a time of great contradictions, often referred to as the Victorian Compromise. And you may ask, what is this compromise? What does it mean? Well, let me tell you that. On the one hand, the progress brought about by the Industrial Revolution, namely the rising wealth of the upper and middle classes and the expanding power of Britain and its empire, but on the other hand, there were grinds in poverty. The mortality rate was up the sky, diseases were spread everywhere, and the deprivation faced by the working classes in Victorian towns and cities across the country were some of the worst in the civilized world. People were forced to live in overcrowded rooms in degraded slums, and the lack of hygiene was extremely severe. Even young children were forced to work. One very important factor was its stress on morality. Victorians paid a lot of attention to morality. A code of conduct was imposed on the people which described every aspect of their being, from the proper appeals, the way they had to be dressed, for instance, to how to converse, everything had rules. For example, the family unit was based around the authoritarian father, with the mother in a submissive role. Basically, women were restricted to domestic confines. They were financially dependent on their husbands if they happened to be married, or on their fathers if they were single or they were kids. All these moral and social political changes ultimately derived in the development of new literary movements in which the authors were able to portray a reality characterized by extreme poverty and a marked sense of social inequality. But out of the various movements that appeared through this period, two genres became particularly important. Those genres were aestheticism and realism. Well, let's begin with the first movement, aestheticism. So, this was an European phenomenon during the late 19th century that had its chief headquarters or beginnings in France. In opposition to the dominance of scientific thinking, the aesthetic thinkers shared the view that a work of art is the supreme value among human products precisely because it is self-sufficient and has no use or moral aim outside of its own being. I know it sounds complicated, but to put it simply, the end of a work of art it is simply to exist in its formal perfection, that is, to be beautiful and to be contemplated as an end in itself. This movement encouraged the Victorian population to fill their lives with the exquisite sensations and to admire the supreme value of beauty and the love of art for its own sake. The aesthetic movement started as a counter-reaction towards the Industrial Revolution and continued to develop until it became a literary branch, in which writers and poets ranked what they thought would be literally appealing for themselves first, and second, for their audience. Therefore, the need to revive the appreciations toward living for the sake of living became the main objective of this movement. The most noticeable representative of this movement was Oscar Wilde. Through the publication of his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde used to say that life imitates art instead of the other way around, and thus society needed to treat their own opinions, beliefs, and political positions as aspects that needed to be considered charming for themselves and for their peers. Then we have the second movement, that is realism. This literary movement tried to truthfully describe reality through language. Yet it is more useful to identify realism in terms of the effect on the reader. Realistic fiction is written to give the effect that it represents life and the social world as it seems to the common reader, evoking the sense that its characters might in fact exist and that such things might well happen. Therefore, the concern for truth, for morality, and for an accurate, unromanticized description of contemporary society define an unmistakable realistic concept of the novel. So, the realistic novel is characterized as the fictional attempt to give the effect of realism by representing complex characters with mixed motives who are rooted in a social class, operate in a developed social structure, interact with many other characters, and undergo plausible everyday modes of experience. The most important writer of the Romantic movement in the Victorian period was Charles Dickens. He worked diligently and prolifically to produce the entertaining writing that the public wanted, but also to offer commentary on social problems and the plight of the poor and the oppressed. One of his novels that expresses this is Great Expectations. Now, to talk about the novel. Great Expectations follows the childhood and young adult years of Pip, short for Philip Peebles, a blacksmith apprentice in a country village. He, by a series of events, comes into a large fortune, his great expectations, from a mysterious benefactor and moves to London where he enters high society. He thinks he knows where the money has come from, but he turns out to be sadly mistaken. The story also follows Pip's dealings with Stella, a young woman he adores, but who cannot return his love. During the course of the novel, Pip comes to realize that his great expectations, that is to say, social standing and wealth, are less important than loyalty and compassion. The basic structure of Great Expectations follows a chronological development of Pip's life, from his childhood innocence to his disillusioned expectations, finally his rejection of the high life and the circular suggestions ending back at the beginning. These chronological structures, of which Dickens narrates, exemplifies Pip's learning process through his moral and emotional turmoil and complies with the opportunity to generate a realistic setting. Great Expect through his moral and emotional turmoil and complies with the opportunity to generate a realistic setting. Great Expectation is also a very good example of a Bildungsroman. I know it doesn't sound like English, well, because it's not. The Bildungsromans is a German French that means novel of formation, and it follows the development of the protagonist's mind and character in the passage from childhood through varied experiences, and often through a spiritual crisis, into maturity, which usually involves recognition of one's identity and role in the world. Pip feels guilt throughout the novel. From the beginning, he wants more from life and more than what he has. He feels guilty that he is ashamed of his home. It is a most miserable thing to feel ashamed of home. He even knows that the working life he was born into may be better, and I had nothing to be ashamed of, but offered me sufficient means of self-respect and happiness. However, we see him change when he has the opportunity for more and become a gentleman. He notes, as I had grown accustomed to my expectations, I had insensibly begun to notice their effect upon myself and those around me. Pip's internal struggle of how getting expectations can change him throughout the novel demonstrates the realistic characteristic of this movement. This story reveals Dickens' dark attitudes towards Victorian society, such as its inherent class structure, flawed judicial system, contrast between rural and urban England, and immorality of high class. Overall, Dickens shows that in Victorian England, life for the upper class was easy, but they were very bad people, not trustworthy. But in contrast, life for the lowest was hard work and painful, but they were the good and the nice people. All in all, the realistic movement was used throughout the Victorian age as a way not only to criticize the treatment done to most vulnerable side of society, but also to explore the necessity to rethink the social values that surround its whole context and that came along as a consequence of industrialism. So, the Industrial Revolution brought about radical change in the way British citizens lived, worked and perceived the world. Constant reminders of time, mortality and social conventions were the main source of inspirations for writers and poets alike, to portray an age surrounded by subjective interpretations, judgment and moral beliefs. In this way, these two literary movements attempted to contextualize most of the way the British society of the 18th century behaved, with all its prejudices, individualist and social perceptions. Basically, in short, this was an era full of the spice towards reality. Well, people, I hope that with this video you can more or less understand what was the life like in the Victorian period. How, even though the Industrial Revolution brought about so many improvements for society, there were still some aspects of society that remained hidden or that people didn't really want to pay attention to. Um, Fortunately, if we can kind of say that, there were some authors that embraced such aspects and created several pieces of literary work so as to show the cruel and the raw reality of the time, and also try to criticize some of the bad behavior people of the time used to have. Well, this has been all. I hope you like the presentation and read the novel. It's great.